Your Highness, distinguished guests, conference participants, ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased this morning to welcome all of you to the Baker Institute's inaugural conference of the Kelly Day Endowment on the Status of Women and Human Rights in the Middle East. I would like to extend a particularly warm welcome to Her Highness, Sheikha Musa bint Nasr al-Misned of Qatar. Her presence here is a rare honor and a genuine privilege for all of us. Her Highness, in her unique, important, and thought-provoking remarks at dinner last night, once again demonstrated her broad vision and comprehensive grasp of the major issues and subjects we will be discussing at today's conference. Our subject, Women in the Middle East, a Contemporary Assessment, could not be more timely and urgent. We are all looking forward to an informative and lively discussion of the complex and often contentious issues surrounding the status of women in the Middle East, including women's education, legal rights, health, and political participation. But before we commence, I would like to thank the many individuals and institutions who have made this conference possible. Leading the list are our sponsors, the Kelly Day Endowment, the Ghadir Irani Discretionary Fund, Baker Botts LLP, and ConocoPhillips. Our special appreciation goes to Mr. and Mrs. Robert Day for their generous support of this program. The Institute is grateful for their extraordinary generosity and honored by their confidence in us. This conference marks only the beginning of the Baker Institute's long-term commitment to the study of women and human rights in the Middle East. I would also like to recognize those who have worked so hard in bringing an event of this scope to fruition. These individuals include Dr. Elora Shahabuddin, who coordinated the substance of this program, Dr. Carol Quillen, the Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at Rice University and the Director of the Banyuk Center for Religious Tolerance, Molly Hip Hubbard, our Development Director, and all the Baker Institute staff who worked with diligence to bring this event to us. Most of all, though, I would like to thank the distinguished experts who have joined us today from around the country and indeed the world. The wealth of scholarship you bring to our proceedings will have a lasting impact. I do not need to detail the daunting challenges that not only women, as Her Highness pointed out last night, but all the people of the Middle East face. Allow me to mention a few. First, large parts of the Middle East are scenes of conflict. Iraq and the occupied territories of Gaza and West Bank, Lebanon come immediately to mind. But tensions exist elsewhere, notably between the United States and Iran. Domestic unrest and international instability tend to push other issues, including women's rights, further back on the national agendas. Second, many countries in the Middle East lack democratic governance, which constrains the ability of citizens, including women, to promote their interests through political means. Third, many Middle East countries lag economically. Too many of the region's economies are marked by low growth, high employment, or both. These factors limit the scope for women's and men's participation in the workplace. Fourth, and by no means least, the Middle East is shaped by traditional cultural views of a woman's place in the family and society. This is a complicated and sensitive subject, all too easily exploited for political advantage. Yet there is no subject more in need of informed, dispassionate discussion. Although I spent much of my professional life living and working in the Middle East, I cannot pretend to be an expert on the issues that will be discussed during our deliberations today. I am here to listen and to learn, but I do hope that our sessions focus on what I consider to be key challenges. For instance, it is critical to demystify Middle Eastern women, or, as Her Highness put it much more eloquently than I could last night, the deframing of women's issues. This is a key phrase that I believe you have introduced into the lexicon of this study, Your Highness. Western public views rarely rise above the stereotypical figure shrouded by a veil. Yet the lives of Middle Eastern women represent a complex mosaic in terms of legal rights, educational attainment, economic opportunity, and a role within the family. For example, how many Americans know that the Prophet Muhammad's wife, Khadija, was one of the most successful businesswomen in Mecca. Talk about breaking through the glass wall ceiling. And this was done in the 7th century AD in our calendar. It is also important to identify the needs of Middle Eastern women. The fundamental question is not, after all, what we want for them, but what they want for themselves. As Nobel laureate Amartya Sen stresses in his Development as Freedom, we must learn to see individuals as active agents of change rather than as passive recipients of dispensed benefits. This begins with understanding and respecting their aspirations. We must also seek common ground between modernizers and traditionalists. Islam, for instance, is a great and compassionate religion, rich and resilient to encompass the equality of women. What we must avoid at all costs, I believe, is casting the advancement of women as a struggle between Western values and Islam. Such a conception is false as a matter of fact. It plays directly into the hands of the demagogues, and it can do great damage to the cause of women in the Middle East. Above all, I urge you in your deliberations to explore practical and constructive ways in empowering the women of the Middle East and to avoid cultural arrogance. There is vast scope for culturally appropriate approaches that can help women enjoy more rewarding lives. And let us not engage in theoretical abstractions or rhetorical points. The women of the Middle East are a force whose past, present, and future contributions will have a major impact in their region and the world. Their empowerment is a cause to which all of us can proudly ascribe. And it is a cause that I am confident this conference will advance. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce to the podium Mrs. Leila Badawi Musa, the Special Representative of the League of Arab States. Leila Musa comes with great credentials. She is very active in a number of associations that you could see in your program notes in her biography, including the National Association for the Protection of the Environment, the Integrated Care Society, the Egyptian Book Board for Young Readers, and many other associations. She is really, truly an NGO person. Leila Musa received her BSS from the Faculty of Engineering, Alexandria University, her MSc in Computer Science from Columbia University, and completed her PhD work in Computer Science at Columbia. She is married to Mr. Amr Musa, Secretary General of the League of Arab States and a good friend of ours. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Leila Musa to the podium.
Thank you, Ed. Her Highness Sheikha Musa bint Nasser al-Masnad, Honorable James Baker, Ambassador Georgian, Ms. Kelly Daly, Ghada Irani, and the Advisory Board, distinguished speakers, distinguished guests. I think I don't have much to say after what Sheikha Musa said yesterday. As an Arab woman, she presented us all in such a beautiful way. I'm pleased to participate in this conference on the status of women in the Middle East, and would like to thank you for your kind invitation that allowed me to be among you today to discuss such an important issue. Our world in the 20th century is marked by the fluid movement of people and culture, bringing diversity to areas that may have had insular histories and making it impossible to ignore the imperative for understanding differences. The status of women in the Middle East has for some time now intrigued the West in general and found a popular place in the scholarships of Western feminists. The forum provided here today is an important contribution to the current conversation because it brings in dialogue voices from inside and outside the experience of Arab women. The Arab world has always been diverse, economically, socially, historically, and politically. But it is important to remember that the Arab people are linked by common language, cultural identity, and heritage. Additionally, the people of the region have suffered political and cultural traumas in common. These include radical social transformation, economic waves of affluence and poverty, and acute resource shortages. Not to mention war and civil strife, of course. The 20th century has been a time of immense transformation in the world, and perhaps among the most significant of these in the Arab world have been the achievement of independence and the emergence of the new post-colonial identities of these nations. Within this context, the progress of the Arab women in terms of self-realization was burdened by the social and historical identity and reality. The Arab Human Development Reports have made clear that key among the challenges identified are the gender imbalances and the importance of urgency of empowering women. Yet the question of how to empower women in the Middle East is a complicated matter. Contemporary Arab feminists have questioned the familiar dichotomy that has opposed tradition to modernity, or that equates liberation with westernization. Some are suspicious about the way how to be modern is so easily equated with the progress, emancipation, and empowerment of women. Is it possible to acknowledge Arab feminism today without taking into account their relationships to the West? There is no denying the European colonial power was fundamental to the historical development of the Middle East. Some scholars clarify this inescapable history and its post-colonial legacy have profoundly affected, in sometimes counterintuitive ways, gender politics of the region. Despite this complex set of circumstances, the Arab world has come a long way in trying to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. In most Arab states, the past 7 years have witnessed rising concern with women's issues in all sections of life. These issues have been incorporated into basic national development priorities at both governmental and grassroots levels. In support of policies aimed at activating and strengthening gender equality and empowering women, most Arab states have either established high-level national mechanisms or modified the mandates of existing mechanisms. The Arab Women Organization has been established under the framework of the League of Arab States and headquartered in Egypt. The first Women Summit, held in Cairo in 2000, issued what is known as the Cairo Declaration, which came into effect in March 2003. To date, AWO is composed of 15 Arab countries members. Its policies are based on the strategy for the enhancement of Arab women, as well as the recommendations of the forums organized under the framework of the first and second Arab Women Summits. In several Arab states, women's issues have come In several Arab states, women's issues have come to account for a substantial debate in governments and national parliaments. And the result has been important accomplishments in the field of legislations. New constitutions have been adopted, or existing constitutions amended to include provisions making all citizens equal before the law in rights and responsibilities, with no gender discriminations in any area of political, social, cultural, or economic life. One major achievement in this area has been the decision taken by some states to review their family laws and ensures that it guarantees gender equality in private matters. In addition, a majority of Arab states have overvalued their laws to eliminate gender-based discrimination and ensure gender equality in public matters as well, including labor, law, social insurance, education, elections, and vital statistics. In this regard, the League of Arab States issued an encyclopedia of status of women in the Arab legislations, a fundamental database for Arab states to benefit from when issuing or amending any law concerning women's issues. It's actually in Arabic, but it will be soon also edited in English. In the critically important field of education, all Arab states have devoted particular attention to the issue of women's education and training, with considerable success in both quantitative and qualitative terms. Many of these states have adopted a meaningful, intense political orientation with an agenda for upgrading the quality of education available to women. In terms of health programs, some states are now developing an integrated family health strategy as a framework for Millennium Development Goals 6, 7, and 8. Combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. Ensure environmental sustainability. Thank you. Establish a global partnership for development. Moreover, Arab states have established a number of national mechanisms working in cooperation with relevant ministerial agencies, international organizations, and the private sector. As a result of these policies and programs, tangible progress has been achieved in women's overall health situation. By way of illustration, it is worth mentioning the dramatic decrease in infant and maternal mortality ratios, which was very high before, the increase of detection and treatment of sexually transmitted diseases, and widespread health education. In terms of political engagement, an increasing number of Arab women are being appointed as ministers. In 1990, a modest 8 Arab countries had female ministers. However, by June 2006, 19 out of 22 Arab states have been women working at ministerial level. Positive developments also occurred at the judicial and international levels, when in 2003, a Jordanian judge was elected to the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Moreover, in June 2006, an Arab woman from Bahrain was the first to be elected President of the United Nations General Assembly. Yet the problems of Middle Eastern women remain acute. Islamic, Christian, and Jewish jurists and theologians, all of them males, have provided Middle Eastern society with the most exclusivist and conservative interpretations of religion laws, which have burdened women in the family, the society, and the state. And we are still living by those interpretations. And the media has not helped. Through a systematic negative portrayal, our stereotyping of the Middle East in general, and the Arab woman in particular, the media has created a dichotomy that forced the Arab woman to choose between the identity as an Arab woman and all that this entails, and the idea of feminist liberation. This condition being equated with a non-Arab culture. It is not surprising that this artificial dichotomy should lead many women to more and more extreme rejection of aspects of modernization that suggest robbing them of their identity as Arab women. To be emancipated, to be saved from patriarchal dominance by the imposition of foreign standards is to achieve one end by sacrificing the other. It becomes self-defeatist in a way. To understand the Arab woman, the Arab woman's complex role in the society, and the ways in which we shall find fulfillment, a dialogue with her, rather than a conversation about her, is necessary. Our world is indeed becoming more and more interdependent, as no culture can remain discrete in the age of virtual and real movement around the world. We become interested in each other. We affect each other's life. The key to a peaceful existence in a context that promotes and protects human rights is understanding beyond and outside one's own trajectory of thinking. When differences are respected, the similarities become visible. As the Arab-American anthropologist Leila remarked in a different context, we should stop harping on differences and look at what unites us. Let us not ask how Arab societies are distinguished from the West, but how intertwined they are, historically and in the present, economically, culturally, and politically. Thank you again for allowing me to address such a distinguished gathering. Thank you.
We are now going to begin our panels, and it's my distinct pleasure to invite to the podium Mrs. Robert Day, Kelly Day, after whom the foundation and this whole program and series is named. Without Kelly's vision and support, this wouldn't happen. So join me in welcoming Kelly Day to the podium.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Sheikha, for coming and speaking so beautifully last night. We were very honored that you took your time and came so far. And Leila, Musa, thank you. Thank you so much. You're probably wondering why I am here and why I'm so interested in all of this. By a strange twist of fate, I ended up in Doha by invitation of Her Royal Highness for the wedding of her son, who was the Crown Prince. And then the next 2 years, I ended up going to the wedding of her next son and then the wedding of her daughter. And I found every country, and this was thanks to Gada Irani, who brought me and Paula Douglas and a bunch of us, Candy, and a group of girls to the Middle East, where we learned that it's a whole world that we didn't know existed, and the most welcoming society I have ever come across in my life, completely different than what I had grown to believe my entire life. And after 3 trips and going to many countries over there, I found this incredible feeling of commonality, because we're all women, we're mothers, we're workers, we're doing the same thing, and we're all working in an opposite direction when we should be working together for a common goal. And I think that if we just realize that some people do things a different way, and if we learn to listen and to educate each other and realize that maybe I do something in a different way, you do something in a different way, but our goal is the same. We want our happy home life, we want our workplace right. We all have the same goals. We just need to accept them to be honored by everybody in our own fashion and the way we do them. And I think the old adage, I am woman, hear me roar, by Helen Reddy, is a little obsolete. We don't have to be that kind of woman anymore. We don't have to run and prove ourselves. Some of us want to stay home. Some of us want to raise a family. Some of us want to work at home. Some of us want to put on a suit, like Sheikha said last night. And I think the mission statement of this endowment is for women and humans and their rights in the Middle East. That means people. And if we respect the rights of people, and we listen and we educate and learn, then we can open the door to less stereotyping and pave the way towards peace, because I think that's what we all want ultimately. And until we talk, we cannot have peace, and until we engage and we know what the other side is thinking, there's no way we can do it. So hopefully this is the beginning of something that will prove to be fruitful and a learning experience for everybody around. I know that it's been wonderful for me, and for my 50th birthday, the Douglases and the Bakers and all my friends got together and started this, and I am eternally grateful because it has opened up a whole new world for me. And I thank you all for coming, and thank you. And am I supposed to introduce the speaker now? Okay. Oh, now it's not about me anymore. Okay. So our first panel on education and empowerment will be moderated by Carol Quillen, who is Associate Professor of History, Director of the Boniak Center, and Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at Rice University. So thank you very much.
It's my great privilege to welcome you to the first panel of this important conference on education and empowerment. And I know that our panel this morning will take up the challenges put forth to us last evening by Her Highness, namely that we deframe the study of women's issues in the Middle East, which for too long have gravitated unhelpfully between the poles of colonial feminism and radicalism. And second, that we see women's issues like education in the context that gives them reality and meaning in people's lives. And as a feminist and as an American, I would like to acknowledge my particular responsibility for combating the ignorance that allows people in my own country to attribute the challenges that face women in the Middle East either to age-old traditional practices or to Islam. And I know this conference is a first step towards the challenges that Her Highness laid out for us last evening. It's my privilege now to welcome to the stage our distinguished speakers for our first panel. I'd like to say a word about the format. It's my understanding that many of our speakers have PowerPoint presentations. They will speak from the podium. So there may be a little musical chairs happening up here. And I will introduce each speaker immediately before she speaks. Our first speaker is Ms. Nadira Chamlu. The title of her presentation is Education, Job Creation, and Female Entrepreneurship. Mrs. Chamlu is Senior Advisor for Economic and Sector Work for the Middle East and North Africa region of the World Bank. Thank you.
I'd like to invite all the panelists, please.
Yes, I will do that, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. It is a great privilege, Your Highness, Sheikha Musa, and Honorable Mr. Baker, to be here, Excellencies, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank, on behalf of the World Bank, for this invitation, this very kind invitation, to add our voice to this very important event and to understanding a very important challenge in the region, in the Middle East and North Africa region. And I hope that following on Your Highness's speech yesterday about deframing the gender issues in the Middle East, that I will hopefully make a small contribution to that mission. What I would like to discuss today is to present to you a little bit the evidence and the data and the analysis that the World Bank has carried out in the last few years, and about where we stand in terms of education, in terms of labor force participation of women, and of course also in terms of the entrepreneurship. Now, I don't quite know how to use this. Here, this. I think the three key questions that I would like to address during this presentation is: have women had access to education? Has this education empowered women economically and politically? And what more can be done to promote women's empowerment in the Middle East? I first like to show you the human capital endowment of the Middle East in 1970 and in year 2000. I think it has expanded even better since year 2000. Excuse me. What I would like to present is that on this side, which is closer to me, is the human capital endowment of the Middle East between men and women. And what you see is that there is a small diamond of life expectancy, primary and secondary enrollment, as well as adult literacy. And within that diamond is the female diamond, which is much smaller than the male diamond. In year 2000, which is the other side, you see that both diamonds have expanded quite a bit, and the female diamond is almost as congruent as the male diamond. There is still a little bit of room to play with respect to illiteracy, but that kind of that is more and more concentrated in the older age cohorts of the population. What I want to show with this is that increasingly the human endowment of the Middle East is equally divided between men and women. Education is a problem. Education is a problem for everybody, but it is not that the women are less educated in terms of quantity. I mean, quality is a different issue, but in terms of quantity, that men and women are equally educated. The next slide is about how the woman in the Middle East compares with the woman in other developing regions of the world. I'm not including in this Europe and North America or the OECD countries, but it's the other 6 developing regions of Africa, Latin America, East Asia, South Asia, and Europe and Central Asia. What you see here again is on the outer side is the human capital endowment of the woman. And we see that the Middle Eastern woman is equally educated, or her human capital endowment is as good, if not better, than the women in other developing regions of the world. But when it comes to empowerment indicators, which is the labor force participation and political participation, she falls considerably behind. So there is this paradox that while on the one hand we have advanced education, we haven't really followed up with empowerment. This next slide is some of the developments since year 2000. What we see in here is in the last 5 years there has been a tremendous growth in the Middle East. And in fact, labor entrants have increased significantly. And much of this labor force participation has come actually from women. As you can see, the growth rate of women entering the labor force has been about 5.2% per year. And what has happened is interesting, that the growth has come from older age cohorts of women. In other words, women are entering the labor force older. In other words, I mean, when I say older, is after school, after being educated, and they're staying in the labor force, which is a very welcome development. In other words, they're not moving out of the labor force after they have children or they have married. So as you can see, much of the growth of the labor force, the male labor force participation has stayed pretty much the same. But what has happened is that the growth has been actually from this part. This has been partially due to the fact, as I mentioned, the high growth rate that the Middle East has experienced. In fact, when we look at the employment growth, the Middle East, this is the MENA region, this is the Middle East region, has had the highest job growth rate in the world, among these 6 developing regions of the world. Unemployment rate has declined significantly, and in fact, this is the unemployment rate. This is the year 2000 and this is the year 2005. However, when we look at male and female unemployment, we see that this is the white bar is the female unemployment and the gray bar is the male unemployment. We see that female unemployment is significantly higher, a multiple of male unemployment. So while women are entering the labor force, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are having a job, they're just looking for a job. And what is important to consider is that the women who are actually looking for the job and entering the labor force, the unemployment among these women is the highest when they're more educated. So somehow, in one way or the other, the region does not provide or does not create jobs enough, or the demand for women to work is not high enough. So if I just would like to point your attention to this figure. This is the female labor force demand in East Asia, and this is the female labor force, female education, the black line. In MENA, it is exactly the opposite, that women have been educated, which is this line, but the demand for their work is actually still down here. So there's this huge gap between the supply of qualified women and the demand for qualified women. Now, how can we increase the demand? So obviously we have to focus quite a bit on the demand side. And what I would like to present to you is some of the findings of a multi-country survey that the World Bank has carried out across all countries, but in the Middle East, we have carried out an enterprise survey of about 4,000 enterprises in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the combined number is 4,000. And the countries we have surveyed is Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, Oman, Morocco, Syria, and Yemen. And what we find in terms of female entrepreneurship is actually quite interesting, at least for people who work on economic issues. We show that in terms of female entrepreneurship, out of these 4,000 companies that we surveyed, women in the Middle East owned about 13% of these companies. Compared to the other regions of the world, it seems to be less in terms of percentages. But when we look at the configuration of who and what size these companies are, we find that actually in the Middle East, this 13% that I just showed here are very much concentrated on the larger scale of companies. In other words, women who own enterprises own big enterprises. They are not the micro entrepreneurs that most often we associate with. They are not the embroiderers or the basket weavers. They have huge or large companies that they manage. In fact, when we looked at Egypt and Lebanon, we saw that women have a greater proportion of enterprises that are in the larger segments of the economy than actually men. So this, in a way, to me or to most of us who are working in this field, was quite surprising because we had not expected these results. When we look at the composition of these enterprises or of these women entrepreneurs across sectors, we find that by and large they are all in the same sectors. For instance, the brown side, we tried to be a little bit gender, deframe, as you were mentioned, to use different colors. The brown is the women and the blue is the men. We find that male and female enterprises are in manufacturing around the same proportion. They are in services around the same proportion, and they are in other industries. We find that about 40% of women own and are individual owners of their enterprises, because very often people say, well, they are there, but they don't actually, they are multiple owners of this enterprise. It is true that the women do own as principal owners. That means 15% or 20% and above families that they own with other family members, but more or less, about 40% are individual owners. We have also often heard that, well, women are owners in name. They don't manage their own companies. They just, sometimes people say that it's the mother who owns and the son who manages it. But when we looked at these enterprises, we found that about 50% of the women actually managed their own companies. So, which was quite a high percentage that we were not expecting to see. In terms of workforce composition, and this kind of ties in with what I was saying earlier, that we need to increase the demand for women workers. When we looked at the worker composition in female and male-owned firms, we saw that actually female-owned firms hired a higher percentage of well-educated workers. In terms of skills level, in terms of education level, and so on. And we also found out that female-owned firms hired a higher proportion of women workers, about twice as high as male-owned firms. But when we looked a little bit more, we dug down a little bit more into the workforce composition, at least the female workforce composition, we realized that while in the male-owned firms, the female workers were mostly in sort of like the lower skilled jobs, in the female-owned firms, they were in higher skilled jobs, in managerial jobs, in technical jobs. So essentially what I would like to say is that promoting female entrepreneurship is one way to create the demand for high-skilled and highly educated women. Just to kind of say, why does it matter and why should we promote women's entrepreneurship, not only because they create more jobs for women and better jobs for women, but I would like to present to you two a few elements in terms of the performance of these firms. Normally, we look at value added per worker and sales per worker. And when we looked at the female-owned firms and male-owned firms, we realized that the female-owned firms had the value added per worker was equal, if not slightly more, but certainly they exceeded. They were much higher in terms of sales per worker than male-owned firms. So in other words, women-owned firms were more efficient. When we looked at exports, we saw that actually female-owned firms exported more. They had a higher percentage of foreign participants in their enterprises. They used more websites, which is very critical in this world, because if you don't have a website, you don't exist. And they made more use of electronic, of emails and other factors that are essentially of importance for high productivity. Yet, one would imagine that here are these firms that are almost equally owned. I mean, in terms of size, they're almost in the same sectors, they perform better. One would imagine that the investment climate would treat them the same way, or that they are faced with the same, let's say, laws, regulations, and so on. But when we surveyed them on these very different, on tax rates, policy uncertainty, macroeconomic instability, finance, tax, corruption, and anti-competitive practices, on a continuous basis, women rated these issues worse than men. I want to add that when we surveyed women alone, we asked them, do you feel that you are discriminated against? Most of them said, no, we don't feel that we are discriminated against. But when we surveyed them collectively as women versus men, the differences are quite telling. What is also interesting is that in terms of finance, which is very often what people think, that finance is the critical, the differences were the least significant. But the issues of, for instance, policy uncertainty, corruption were very, very much critical factors. So what I would like to state here is that, in fact, promoting women's entrepreneurship through removing barriers that women face, not necessarily just in finance, but across the board, be it in terms of regulation, be it in terms of application of regulation to women entrepreneurs, could lead to a higher, I would say, growth of female entrepreneurs, as well as greater job creation for women. And with this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Shamlou. Our next speaker is Dr. Isabel Coleman. Dr. Coleman is Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy and Director of Women and Foreign Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. She will speak on rereading the texts, religious education, and women in the Middle East. Dr. Coleman.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Mr. and Mrs. Baker and Sheikha Musa, and also Mrs. Day for hosting this conference. I think as many presentations today will make clear that education is such a critical driver of women's empowerment. And as you can see from Nadare's very interesting charts that she just showed, women have made enormous gains in education in the Middle East in the last several decades. In fact, literacy rates for women have tripled since 1970. And today, in many countries, they have achieved, as her chart showed, they've really achieved parity between boys and girls in school at the primary school level. And while there is still greater rates of illiteracy, those are concentrated among older populations. And now you see a new gender gap emerging in the Middle East, which is that more women than men are going on to higher education. In some countries, there are more women than men at the secondary level. And now in several countries, there are many more women than men at the tertiary level, graduating from university. This is true in Qatar, as I know. And I'm just back from Iran. There are 64% of university graduates are women today in Iran. And many of the women that I spoke to there, they're seeing a new crisis in their generation where they're so much better educated than the men. They worry about finding husbands who are equal to them in educational levels. So I think there's a new issue to worry about. But what I'm going to talk about today is a narrow slice of education, but one that I think is potentially very influential and very important, and that is religious education. Religious education for women is critical for a number of reasons. Clearly, the Islamic revival of the last several decades ensures that across the Middle East, Islam will remain the social and political touchstone for the vast majority of people. Today, Islamic law, Sharia, at least informs, if not outright determines, many legal codes, especially in the all-important area of family law. And family law, pertaining as it does to such sensitive issues as marriage, divorce, custody, and inheritance, is a contested issue in many Middle East countries today, and an area where women have much at stake. Many women's advocates, recognizing that religious authority is very difficult to challenge in today's religiously charged environment, they have largely abandoned attempts to replace Sharia with secular law, and instead are working to promote an Islamic discourse that allows for greater reconciliation between international human rights standards and Islamic law. And these women are joined by the growing ranks of devout women who want to maintain their piety, but also enjoy their rights. And increasingly in many countries, advancing women's rights, their political and legal rights, depends now on the acceptance of more progressive interpretations of Islam. So across the region, women themselves are digging into Islamic jurisprudence, arming themselves with religious arguments to show that women's rights within Islam are more than sufficient to support an agenda of women's empowerment. The efforts of scholars to find support within the Quran for women's empowerment goes back way more than a century. A group of reformers across the region, starting in the 19th century, began to argue vehemently for women's emancipation based on their readings of Islamic texts. And in the 19th century, leading intellectuals like Muhammad Abdu and Qasim Amin in Egypt sought to disentangle Islam from cultural traditions that had resulted in women having a greatly reduced role in society. So began an intellectual struggle over the true meaning and intention of the Quran with regard to issues such as women's seclusion and veiling, polygamy, divorce, and female education, an intellectual struggle that in some respects still exists today. The big change in recent decades is that women are becoming increasingly active in this debate. A century ago in Egypt, when less than 0.5% of women were literate, the debate was carried on by a small group of elite men and was very much tied up with their views on modernization and how best to resist colonialism. The biggest challenge in today's world is injecting women's voices now into that debate. And with rising female education levels, women are joining that religious discourse more and more. At the most basic level, many women are simply riding the tide of Islamic revival and have joined one of the many Islamic study groups cropping up around the region that are targeted specifically at women. These groups are hard to classify since they vary widely. Some are informal groups run out of private homes. Others are more institutionalized, associated with a mosque or a madrasa, a religious school. Many of these groups do promote social conservatism, and they've been instrumental in encouraging women to wear the hijab, which rates of wearing the hijab have increased significantly across the region in the last several decades. And they're therefore seen as instruments of conservative Islam. But by getting women to engage more deeply with their faith, a new generation of women is learning to understand their rights within Islam. They're learning to ask questions and to question the answers. Study sessions cover such topics as whether a woman has the right to vote differently from her husband, whether women have the right to work outside the home, to pursue higher education, and the right to divorce. They derive their answers from reading the texts, contextualizing certain passages, and relying on a range of Islamic scholarship. Participants in these groups say that when the occasion arises, they are able to reason from the Quran on many contentious issues on an equal footing with men. And they're better able to point out that many common restrictions on women are not religiously sanctioned, but simply based on outmoded traditions. The discussions supported by these study groups are further encouraged by the growing attention paid to women's issues by the region's increasingly open media. Satellite cable channels like Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya have devoted whole shows to debating the religious rationale for certain restrictions on women, from the ban on women driving in Saudi Arabia to restrictions on voting, serving as judges, holding public office. While most of the religious experts on these panels are men and male clerics, there are now some female voices joining the fray. More women are pursuing Islamic studies to the level of becoming noted Islamic scholars themselves. And while this line of study is still somewhat controversial, new attention is being paid to the rich history of women as Muslim scholars and jurists throughout the ages. Muhammad Akram, who's a Sunni scholar, working right now at Oxford, is creating an encyclopedia of Muslim women who have taught the Quran, transmitted hadith, and made law as jurists. And his project now has more than 8,000 entries, some dating back 1,400 years. Some of these women who reached the ranks of jurists issued key fatwa on issues ranging from commerce to Hajj rituals. And by showing the rich tradition of women as scholars, Akram's work is helping break down the cultural barriers that persist today in keeping women out of religious studies. And those barriers slowly are beginning to fall. The prestigious Al-Azhar University in Cairo has a women's college. In Qatar, the head of the Sharia College is a woman, and as I learned last night, she was elected with unanimous support from her peers. And Turkey has been particularly active in promoting female religious leaders. There are now more than 450 women preachers in Turkey, known as vaize. And as one of these vaizes explained, these are her words, traditionally women mostly learned Islam through men, their fathers, their husbands, and imams in mosques. So they hear only the male point of view of Islam, but there is a need of a female perspective. My role is to help separate out the many wrong traditions and misinterpretations of Islam in relation to women. Morocco has followed a similar path. More than 50 women there have been trained as religious preachers, known as morshidat. These women are able to perform the functions of a male imam in the mosque, except still they cannot lead prayer. They're encouraged to lead discussions and give advice, especially to women. Some people in these countries are very enthusiastic about the new role of women as religious leaders. And some women in particular believe that women preachers make better listeners. As one woman said, referring to her local morshidat, we can talk about everything, things which we cannot talk to with a man. Before, with the imam, we just listen to what he says. Now we can bring issues here to discuss with her, and we're getting different answers. However, none of this is without controversy. Many say still it's not natural for women to have positions of religious authority, and many women themselves adhere to this position, claiming that it goes against the Quran. Others say that these reforms promoting women as religious leaders are little more than window dressing, that they're bold-faced attempts by their governments to push their own brand of Islam on people. For example, in Morocco, some view the morshidats as simply instruments of government propaganda. Indeed, in those countries where women have made the greatest strides as religious leaders, there is clear state control of the religious establishment, and so it's easier to force some of these difficult changes upon a reluctant population. Yet, as the rich tradition of women religious leaders from earlier centuries is being rediscovered and new precedents are being set, I think it's likely that the acceptance of women as religious leaders will only grow. And so too will women's role in shaping that all-important arena of religious discourse. Thank you.